We're live on Monday. Let's get started. Hello, Smart Money Tree podcast listeners. Welcome to this week's show. My name is Kirk Chisholm, and I'll be your host. So today, I'm joined with my good friend Doug Hagren. Hey, Doug.
How you doing, Kirk? Happy Monday.
Happy Monday. Happy Monday. It is another beautiful weekend. I seriously, I feel like I'm living in California. Every day is perfect here.
I thought it was because you have high taxes and lots of regulation. I wasn't sure where you're going with that.
And mudslides and forest fires and
Correct.
bad politicians and homelessness. No, that's not us.
Okay.
We are definitely not to be confused with California. Anyway.
Watch where you're going with that comparison.
Well, I could make fun of California and people say, well, it's because you're not a Democrat or whatever. I'm like, well, I live in Massachusetts, so, thumb my nose at you.
And I live in Minnesota, and literally the only difference between California and Minnesota right now is basically different initials in our name. I mean, we even have a coastline. We have a sea here. I mean, other than that, they want to be California in almost all capacity. So.
Well, Doug was just telling me. I want you to tell the stat, Doug. There was there's one reason why Minnesota and Massachusetts are much better than California and just about 45 other states. You want to talk about that for a second?
Absolutely, Kirk. So this is interesting. I got to pull it back up somehow because I accidentally just somehow got off my stat page. But right now, really interesting enough. So the U.S. Is starting to feel the pressure of what's going on with household expenses right now. And right now, they came out with a statistic that says that the share of adults, and I'm actually going to give this, let me put this over here so you can share it if you wish to. Hold on a second. If I can get back to where I can actually post it for you. Here it is. Hold on. Here it comes. But basically, 37.4% of Americans, adults, because I don't think the kids are really feeling this the same, are experiencing difficulty paying for household expenses. And it was a huge jump. Ironically, there are only 5 states in the entire country that are right now reporting that less than 31% of the adults are having trouble paying for those expenses in the previous week. Again, this was between June 25th to July 22nd. Of those 5 states, 4 of them are in your neck of the woods: Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. The 5th, Minnesota. As a matter of fact, the state that has the least amount is Vermont, Bernie World. And the state second is actually Minnesota. Every other state has over 31% of adults that are struggling to pay for expenses. Ironically, from that, what do the states I mentioned have in common? They are all predominantly very liberal, left-leaning states. The states that have the highest amount of adults experiencing difficulty are predominantly right-wing Republican states. States like Alabama, Mississippi, Indiana, Louisiana, Florida, Oklahoma, West Virginia have the highest amount. Now, I will throw in there that New York is at 40%. So that's not saying everything. And then, of course, California is 37%. But what's interesting, too, and I don't have the exact specific statistics in front of me, because I actually had pulled this up, and if I can find it, I will bring it back. But the highest number of people that are on welfare actually takes welfare subsidies. Like for every dollar they produce, it's something like $2 to $4 they take back in welfare is actually a lot of those same right states. For example, like Mississippi, Alabama. So ironically, again, we do like to dog on a lot of the policies. We do like to, especially, between, left and right. But when it comes to feeling financially comfortable, there are some arguments that certainly say that states that have tended to have more liberal policies are, and I'm not saying causation. Again, we talk a lot about causation correlation here, but it does, does tend to be the states that have a fair amount of more social programs. The ones that are ironically, the ones that hate the system the most, that complain about the system the most, a lot of those right-leaning states actually have a significantly high number of people that are on welfare programs, which again, this comes down to, and I'm going to say this about both sides of the fence in the argument. I think it just continues to argue that a lot of people that argue their political positions, wherever they are, lack a lot of information about where they're coming from with their arguments. I'm not saying one's right or wrong, but like, it's, I don't like a welfare system. I don't want to give my money. Well, statistically speaking, your states are taking most of it. So where's this argument coming from? I think a lot of us, more than anything in this world, with all this information we have, are still very stuck in the mud when it comes to the opinions and the polarization and the politicization that occurs that isn't necessarily correlated to what you say you believe and what's really kind of where you're getting a lot of your benefits from. Your thoughts, Kirk?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, when I was growing up, I have a friend who he was dating a girl for a while. At some point, was living with her, ended up getting her pregnant accidentally, even though they were on the path to getting married at some point. But got her pregnant. They were still, I forget what age it was, maybe 18 or 17 or somewhere in that range. Anyway, so they're living together. They got a kid together. They're not married. And the state required him to pay child support to her. And, they're both like, why? We're living together. And the funny thing was, or maybe not so funny, is the money he had to pay to the state to support her. I don't have the exact numbers, but if he gave the state $100, they would give her $80. She wouldn't get $100.
$20 service fee to get her the money.
Yeah.
We complain when the banks take what, 3%.
Right. Yeah. So the state took their vig from the situation. They didn't want to do it because they're living together. It's ridiculous. There's no reason that he should pay the state and the state should pay her. It's totally absurd. But apparently there's enough people who don't pay, and so they're just like, well, we don't care. We're just, even though she said, no, I don't want to do this, they said, no, we're doing it anyway. There's definitely some ridiculousness that kind of goes on out there in the system. In Massachusetts, I will say, probably part of the reason why we have so much in welfare to give is because we have enough people earning a lot of money. And I think that's the other part of this that Doug didn't mention, is that when you have states that earn a lot of money, we have really wealthy people who are making a lot and paying a lot in taxes. Well, that's money they can use to pay welfare. Now, I'm not saying it's good or bad, but it kind of ties into this other element that is coming down the pipe, which is, no one who understands anything about economics thinks that universal basic income is a good idea. It's a terrible idea, and any sort of background economics will tell you it's a terrible idea.
We had it during COVID. That's what a lot of the money that was given out was, and look where we are today.
Well, it wasn't quite the same, but that was just giving you a pile of money. The concept of universal basic income was parroted by quite a few people, and it started with the big tech companies. The people have been sitting around and looking at the future and saying, this doesn't look good. Let me come up with a quote unquote socialist idea of dealing with this. And, I think maybe their heart's in the right place, but their brain wasn't, in that, if you put people on universal basic income without having to work, people aren't going to work. And that's actually a negative on society. Maybe maybe you have to do something to earn it. Like maybe you give her, I'm just hypothetically, I'm not saying it's a good idea, but if you're going to give universal basic income, which I think is a bad idea because all it does is cause inflation and it causes price to rise everywhere. So in itself, it's a problem. I'm not saying that there is a good solution to the AI problem and robotic problem. All the things that are going to take our jobs in the next 10 to 20 years. I'm not saying there's a good solution. I'm just saying this one's particularly bad. Is that, you have to make people work for it. You have to make them do something, sweeping the streets, whatever it is. You just have to make people do something because people need to be productive. And so I think one of the challenges as I've been going down a rabbit hole lately on AI, robotics, and all the new technology coming up in the next, well, coming up really quickly. And I think the scariest thing is that the changes are exponential, and not even in the facet that we've ever been accustomed to, right? If you remember prior to the internet, things moved really slow, right? You had advancements, but it was really slow. Um, Now, since the internet came about, now you can get information, you can get voice, you can get video across the world in seconds, and now the whole world's connected as if we're living right next door. I don't need to go to work. I can just work from my house, and I can work with a guy from India or Singapore or wherever, right? Because the whole world is connected, which is a good thing, except for the fact that it sped everything up. So all of the speed of things was slower before. Now it's quicker. People are more stressed. They got less time, not more. But when you think about the speed of change that happened, that was still relatively slow. Now you start thinking about AI, right? AI, I mean, robotics is not really going that fast, but but if you look at AI, that's going to be an exponential change. It already has. People were thinking, well, it's just going to be it's just going to be the math, the STEM jobs that'll be taken away by computers. Well, it turns out that all the artsy jobs are taken away, all the creative stuff. That was the first thing to go. And so, when you're thinking about change in our society, and this is going to freak a lot of people out, so maybe you should stop listening to this. But if the more I've researched and thought about this, the more scared I get, is because the implications on culture, on society, on our economy are enormous. They're huge, as Trump would say. They're enormous because it's not the enormity of the change. It's the fact that it's really hard. I mean, you listen to the top thinkers in AI and in technology, and they're all saying the same thing. We can see up to a point. After that, we don't know where it's going to go because the change is so rapid. It's really hard to fathom what could or would happen with all the changes and what happens after the quote unquote singularity and so on and so forth. But the challenge is how do you predict what's going to happen? How do you manage society in a society where people don't have jobs because AI has taken all the jobs? And in some cases, it's really a search for meaning, because what's your purpose if you don't have a job? And if you don't have a job, how do you put food on the table? There's a huge rabbit hole that you go down. And I'm not saying I'm a favor of universal basic income. I'm just saying I understand why the conversation's happening. And I think that's the important part, is to understand why these things are happening and the importance of what's going to happen in our economy and how you should be thinking about things, how you should be thinking about jobs, how you should be thinking about income, how you should be thinking about the economy, right? As Doug was talking about, it's people are experiencing difficulty paying for household expenses. That's going to get worse. Like, we've only started down that road, and that's only going to get worse. And so we have obviously an election coming up. That's going to be there's going to be a lot of impact there, depending on who you choose. But at the end of the day, neither party is going to impact the change in technology that we're seeing. So I wanted to mention one thing, and we'll get into other news because we skipped over our typical mindset piece in the beginning. But I did want to mention this one thing. Doug and I were talking about this beforehand. If you haven't heard of this, you need to hear about it. It's the BOI reports, and I'm sorry, the BOIR reports. Right? It's a BOIR. Yeah, it's a BOIR. So is that what it is? I'm searching for it. It's not coming.
No, it's the BOI.
Oh, the BOI. That's
FinCEN.
why.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, it's the BOI report, the BOIR. Yep. Okay. So beneficial ownership information reporting with FinCEN.gov. Now, for those of you who aren't aware of this, you've got another 3.5 months before you get fined heavily. And essentially what it is the government, as of this year, is requiring everybody who has a business or, I believe, a trust or any sort of entity.
Which are all business entities by the government view.
Right. So they've lumped trusts in there as well, just for those of you who don't think you have a company. You're required to report on the FinCEN website. And it's not too difficult. You probably have to spend a little time to figure it out, but it's relatively easy. But the fact is, you have to report this. And if you don't, you get you get a big fine. It's like $300 a day or some crazy number. But the point is, you have to do it. I'll have to look up what the fine is. But they make it very obvious that you have to do it. You have to basically, they want to know who the beneficiaries are of the entities. You know,
$591 per day.
okay, yeah. So that's not something I want to pay. So I'll just recommend everybody go out there and file this before the end of the year, or you're going to be in deep doo doo, as they say. And the government might come back later and say, "Well, we'll give you another year." It probably won't. And you've had a whole year to do it. The challenge is it's kind of useless, and I'm sure it'll have some report down the line that they'll be able to go after people, and I'm sure there's some bigger plans at play in the government of what they're going to do with this information. But at the moment, you have to do it, and it kind of stinks, but just be aware of it. So just wanted to mention it. So I think everyone is now. I know all the accountants are aware of it because they've been getting, they've had plenty of CE credits throughout the year. But I definitely wanted to say it. Let's touch on one thing, and I'll give it back to Doug. So getting back to my AI discussion, one of the things to be aware of is the impact of all of the things in our society that we don't think about when you have this exponential change of AI. And if you look at Social Security, and we all know that at some point in the next 10 or so years, Social Security is going to run out of money. In about 10 years, Social Security, Medicare, and pensions are all going to run out of money at the same time. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important if you're getting Social Security that you actually get a check. My prediction is they're not going to really fix it. They'll alter it from now until then, and that'll maybe move it out from 10 years to maybe 15 or 20 years, but it's still going to run out of money at some point. So either you're not going to get a benefit, which is going to be a huge problem for people, or, I don't know what their fix is going to be. It's usually retire later, get less money, fewer people qualify, kind of a thing. That's usually what they'll end up doing. But at some point, they're going to run out of money because the government is irresponsible. So how are we going to handle this? Well, what the government's probably going to do when they run out of money is they're just going to start printing money, which means higher inflation, right? So that's probably going to happen. Same thing with pensions and Medicare. And the state pensions are in really rough shape. And the states can't print their own money, which is going to be even more interesting. So if you really think about the impact of what's going on right now, it's going to get much, much worse in many different ways. And that's just inflation. When you look at AI, AI is going to accelerate a lot of things and cause more problems. We don't know all of the problems yet, but I know a crisis of meaning is going to be one of them. Of what's my purpose in life if I'm not earning an income? What do I do with myself? Like things like that nobody's talking about, that is going to be a huge problem. Also, for the fact that it's going to take a bunch of jobs. Now, people will probably retool themselves and find new jobs. The problem is it's going to be taking so many jobs. What are the new jobs going to be? Oh, you say, well, I could have my kids be programmers. Really? Because AI does the programming now. They do all the coding. It's not 100%, but it's 80, 90% there. So you don't need as many coders because AI is doing the coders. What about medicine? Well, my kid will be a doctor. He'll always be safe. Really? Because I was looking at some medical stuff I'm looking at for my kid. I'm on there and I'm putting stuff into ChatGPT and it's giving me a better diagnosis than my doctor. So how long is it going to be before doctors are not useless, but not all doctors, by the way. The specialists probably be okay. But the generalists are probably not going to be useful because they're not good at diagnosing stuff. That's one of the challenges with medicine is everybody's a specialist and nobody's good at diagnosing things in general. But ChatGPT is, right? So you think of all these different aspects of society that are going to be changed by the functionality of this new technology that is going to wipe the slate clean in a lot of professions. So I struggle because you try to figure out, like I get young kids and a lot of people listen to this do. What do you do for your kids? I honestly don't know. I don't know, because by the time they're or out of college, they're not going to be able to find jobs. What are they going to study? I don't know, because every profession's impacted. I don't think there's a profession that I could come up with that will not be impacted in one way, shape, or form. And if you think, well, what about plumbers and tradespeople and craftsmen? Yeah, but they're creating robots right now that maybe not in 10 years, but maybe 20 at the most, they'll be able to do those jobs too. So there's nothing that's safe right now. And I think the biggest question is, it's going to be a crisis of purpose and usefulness, frankly. The economics are a different thing altogether. But it's a question of whether we end up in Star Trek territory, where there's no currency. It's just, there's no money. People just do whatever they want. And that'll be a really interesting thing, whether it's Star Trek or whether it's the zombie apocalypse. I don't know. But it's going to be interesting to see how things change. And frankly, as we get an election coming up, it's going to be really important to have people who we elect who actually drive this in the right direction and not just try to pilfer from the government till. So, Doug, what else do you want to talk about today? We've got a lot of things in the pipeline.
Yeah, well, I want to back up for a second because I know we had a little bit of it kind of came at full circle when it talked about kind of where the jobs are going to go with AI. And by the way, I just posted something really interesting that the recent statistics on ChatGPT for some reason. So if we go back to November 2022, kind of the rise of ChatGPT, and by April, May of that year. By April, May of 2023, it had really peaked out to about 1.8 billion visits. And it had been staying fairly consistent with a little bit of a dip there until May of this year. But for some reason, and again, I don't have any explanation, I just found this very interesting, that as of, about April of this year, the amount of monthly visits to ChatGPT have plummeted. They have dropped down to back where they were in the pre-February 2023 range and continuing to decline. Now, granted, I don't have any data that shows here since maybe the end of June. I don't know if it's tipped back up. This is from Goldman Sachs. I do know that I have kind of talked to some other people out there that are using some different technologies. So obviously, when ChatGPT came out, it was absolutely a game changer. But I know that, so I was talking to someone this past week who's been using something called Perplexity AI, and he found it to be much more useful, because one of the differences, and I'm not here to endorse it by any means, but what Perplexity does that ChatGPT has kind of failed to do is cite references, and sources, which again, if you're doing work and kind of a lot of people are using ChatGPT for research and kind of information, what's the problem with it is, where's the information coming from? So I don't know if it's because of competition, although if it was competition, I would think there would be more of a gradual decline. Just thought this was very interesting to see how big this has dropped off. The other thing is and I touched on it a little bit, but if we go back to the universal basic income, the point that I kind of had started to make there with universal basic income is what we saw a little bit of that with COVID not necessarily just the injection of capital, but really had more to do with what was going on with unemployment, because you talked about having metrics you have to meet. Unemployment historically has certain metrics that you must do in order to stay on unemployment. You must be actively looking for a job. There's got to be, things that you're kind of showing proof that you're out there looking. You can't just sit back. Well, during COVID, they waived those requirements for an extended period of time, where basically instead of getting unemployment for 6 months to 18 months, you basically were given, they were allowing people to continue to get unemployment without the requirement of looking for a job, because there weren't any. Everything was shut down for an extended period of time. We saw a taste of this because once it came back to where jobs were opening again, it took a little bit of lag time before the unemployment requirements started to come back into enforcement. And that, of course, based off of that, we saw a tremendously slow uptick in the amount of people that were coming back into the labor force. Now, there are many variables to that. Some people just left the labor force because we do have retirees that are occurring. Some people tried, we're working to get income in different ways. We've had the rise of gig economy and the rise of people kind of working, there are people playing the stock market and Bitcoin and other things like that. But now we're back to a point where we are starting to see people back in these jobs. But it took a long time, because if you're getting a paycheck every month, and some of these, in many ways, some of these checks were higher than what people could make working hours, and obviously a lot less stress, and using that money to kind of support things, obviously that had tremendous strains on the labor economy, which of course helped to drive up the prices that needed to be paid for those jobs. I remember for a long time, for a while, Bruegger's around here, which I know Bruegger's because I believe it's Massachusetts based.
Yep.
A lot of the Bruegger's have dining rooms. They had them all shut down. And they said, you can't eat here. It's going to be takeout. I'm like, well, why? Because we don't have enough people here to be able to clean up. Like we've only got 2 people working on staff. We can't get anybody. I had many conversations with managers about what was going on at the time, and people just wouldn't come back. We're talking looking at, getting 100, and I think she told me she was getting 100 resumes for jobs. And when she'd reach out to them, only like basically 10 responded. And of the 10 that responded, every one of them had like criminal backgrounds. Like they were unemployable, right? So it was, I think that's just a little bit of a taste. The other thing too is that when you have that injection of capital, whether it comes from PPP or it comes from just an income that, people don't have to work for to necessarily get, it does contribute to inflation. I'm not saying it's a cause of inflation, because we've talked about inflation on this show, educating that it's 2 sides, right? It's having more income, in other words, supply of capital, and a demand for goods, versus what goods can be produced and the supply of those goods to match it. This is why we've said there was really no inflation after 2008, because yes, we had QE, but we also had an increase of production. We go into COVID, you had an increase of capital, easy capital, PPP, lots of money from the government. We didn't have the workers and the production. Guess what? Welcome to inflation. So if you give people income and they don't need to work for it, and therefore businesses now if AI can supplant them, it's different, because then maybe production can go up and match the income. But if there's a disequilibrium going on there, that could be a contributor to indefinite inflation, because lots of people with money, but not the ability to necessarily produce to keep up with that. So again, I think that's one of the, the major potential disruptions that absolutely, could occur there. The other thing that another thing I thought was really interesting, you talked about, the benefits of BOI reporting. Again, this is very interesting because, I know Kirk, kind of touched on it really quickly, like, oh, you better get this done. But what we were talking about a little bit before the show is all the information that the government is looking for is already out there. These companies are all registered anyway. They've created this other layer of, government enforcement. They say it's to help prevent financial crimes like money laundering, tax evasion, to increase transparency in company ownership structures. I don't know about you, Kirk, and anybody else listening that has a business. Every year that I file my 1120 or my Schedule C, it says who the officers are. It says who the owners are. It's all out there under public record. But now we've got, this passed in 2021 for corporate transparency. It's already there. If I lie about my officers on my return, they already could enforce it. But one of the things that we've talked about is the statement of unemployment or jobs. This has been something over the last 18 months. They've gone back and restated the number of jobs that have actually been employed. They said employment was great. We've talked about this. First of all, a lot of that is, has been restated. It's like a lot of it's part-time, people working 2-3 jobs. It has not been as originally presented. Secondarily, we've also gone back and restated that where is the majority of jobs happening? Government. Okay. The government has been hiring people left and right. Again, one of the things on this is when you create a new regulation, they got to have a bunch of people to enforce it. So again, this is something that puts a lot of people into a government position to enforce something that unfortunately the government already had the data for. So great. We're
That sounds
employing.
familiar, Doug.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it does sound familiar, and like everything that ever occurs, right?
Yeah, it's it's funny when you really think about it, and I'm gonna have to put this on for a minute because I'm gonna go down
Oh
some
boy,
rabbit
the
holes.
tinfoil.
Yeah, I got the tinfoil hat out for those of you audio viewers. Yeah, so I mean, when we're obviously in the prediction business somewhat, right? Because no one knows the future. I think we all have to acknowledge that nobody knows the future, and because if you don't acknowledge it, then you're not really in the real world, right? Because we're not good at predicting the future. Now, AI, from my understanding, is nobody knows this for sure except for the people behind the scenes, but my understanding is they're deliberately throttling the LLM models so that people are not predicting the future. Now they've already claimed that I believe the AI is better at predicting the weather 10 days ahead than humans are. So how long is it going to be before it's 20, 30, 100 days? Like that's going to be really interesting, right? But I believe that the large LM models by Google, by OpenAI, and a few others are throttling the ability for AI to actually predict the future. Because if you think about how disruptive that's going to be, well, why wouldn't you want to predict the weather in advance? Well, yes, that's helpful. But what about the stock market? What about gambling? What about games? What about all of this other stuff that's happening? Um, and you kind of go down this rabbit hole of, well, if it starts to predict the future, it's been hypothesized that that is what some of these engineers got really scared about, is that it allowed AI to predict the future, and it started to really spin out of control, and they had to shut it down. That, to me, they haven't exactly said this, but people have hypothesized that that is the point that they got really scared, is when they allowed it to do this. So I'm going to be really curious where things go, because if we don't allow it, some other country will. This technology is out there; it's not going away. But the trend that I see as most interesting is, I mentioned this last week. You have this pendulum swinging back and forth. Politics, it's left, right, left, right. It's been going on for decades. It's nothing new. Um, but how about the other theme that we talked about last week, which is centralization versus decentralization, right? New technology comes out, it decentralizes. The internet was great. You decentralize information. Everybody could have information all over the place. And then it got centralized with Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn and all these platforms and Google. Like they centralized the information, and of course, then it got dangerous because now you got companies like Google, which are trying to basically change the election results by their Google search, and you have these other big tech that are doing the same thing. I mean, I'm trying to not make this political, but I have to use this example.
Almost impossible.
Yeah, I know. Everything's political these days. But look at the Hunter laptop last election, right? They didn't want the corporate media, all those social medias, they didn't want it to come out because they were afraid they were going to change the election. But it was true, right? It was true. And so they end up changing the election by not changing the election, right? You can't not make changes. Like you can't look at you can't look at that as your thesis, right? Because as soon as you try to change the future, you've changed the future, right? So it kind of brings up this question of like technology, like Google. Like I don't like using Google search engine because it's messy. It's changed lately. Forget the politics of it. It's just messy. Like I just don't want to use it. But it's really easy for me to use ChatGPT and ask questions because the answer actually comes out pretty clean. And I know it's big tech, behind it, but that's not the point. Like, why would I Google something when I can go to ChatGPT and put the question in there and then get a very thorough answer, right? I'm not going to go look up a company website because, Google can do that easier. But like, how much can I put in my 401k in 2024? I could put that in ChatGPT. It's going to give me an answer. It's going to give me a very thorough answer, and it's going to answer a ton of questions. as opposed to, well, I can go to Google, let me find a website, let's see if they have all the answers. Well, I don't have this, let me look at another one. And it's just much more inefficient. So what I find interesting is what's going to happen to Google? Like, what's going to happen to their search engine, right? What's going to happen to all these websites, these companies that are basically centralized? Well, they're going to start decentralizing. And here's the theme so I was talking to a friend of mine this weekend, and I'm actually going to kind of go down this rabbit hole a little bit next week, is we were talking about the application of AI in the next, in the future, right? The next day, next month, next year, 10 years. And so the centralization approach is we're all going to use ChatGPT or Bard or one of these big corporate LLM models. No, what we're going to do is we're going to create our own. We're going to dump our own data in it. It's going to get to know us personally, and it's going to help us personally based on how we build it. Now, you can use the corporate version. They're going to have all your information. It's going to be free or low cost. They're going to have your information. They're going to sell your information. They're potentially going to bait you, right? It's like, they talked about last, 4 years ago, what's the best way to, to have people vote Democrat? Well, it's to talk about Trump because he was highly provocative. What's the best way to get people to vote for Republican? Show an American flag. You don't have to say anything. Just show a flag, right? So there's persuasive ways that these companies already know on how they can persuade people subtly, and you don't even know is happening. So they're already doing this to get the results that they want, right? And we're human beings. We're basically, pattern recognition machines. But if you build your own, and it's a walled garden, you build it, you decide what data it gets. Now all of a sudden, you don't have somebody else controlling you. You have something that is helping you, and it's your second brain, and it's what you want it to be. Will there be people who use the corporate version? Sure. But anyone of their right mind shouldn't want to do that. You should want to create your own version of your own AI, your own LLM, whatever you need it to be. That's the direction that it's going to start, or at least logically it should start. And if it goes in that direction, the world's going to be a much better place. If it goes in the corporate direction, it's going to be nothing but brainwashing. I mean, we're doing it. We're seeing it now in the media. The media is brainwashing people with the quote unquote facts. I'll call it the corporate media. They're brainwashing people. If you follow the news in either party, you can see this. It's obvious. You can see behind the curtain. You can see the wizard. It's obvious that they're being brainwashed by corporate media. And it's both sides. I want to be clear. This isn't like a politics thing. This is a reality thing. They do this because that's how they make more money. And you might say, well, they're evil. I don't know. Maybe they're just a corporation that's trying to make more money. Now, yes, is there nefarious purpose behind the scene? Sure. There are always people who do that. But they're trying to make money. How do they do that? By hitting your fear sensor, by hitting your greed sensor, by getting you in an echo chamber and telling you things that you already, quote unquote, know to be true. And they're just telling you more of it. So you don't get both sides because they're giving you what you want to hear. And you keep coming back because it strokes your ego. Like, that's how our brains work. And if you don't know that's how your brains work, then you probably don't know they're doing that to you. And you're wondering like, oh, this presidential candidate is really good. And I like the fact these people agree with me. It makes me feel really smart. That's human nature. I like it too. I like it when people tell me I'm smart, right? Even when I'm not. But that's what's going on. So if you think about it, take that and leverage it up like 100-fold. Because now you're going to let an AI into your brain, because you're basically going to have your private AI that's going to be managed to some extent by other people. I would never do that, ever, because you're basically brainwashing yourself with whatever other people want you to believe. Now, if you have your own, then you can effectively brainwash yourself and you're still in an echo chamber, but you're not going to have other people brainwashing you. That's the dangerous part, because how do you let governments in there? Do you let big corporations? And we've already seen the facts are out that the government has tried to manipulate social media companies. Zuckerberg came out there and made a statement a few weeks ago that, yeah, they tried to manipulate me into manipulating other people, right? And it came out with the Twitter files, and Zuckerberg came out and said, so it's not a conspiracy theory on any side. It's truth. Everyone's coming out and saying it, which is good, because that's what happened and people need to know about it. But if you're not aware that's going on, then you're not going to be able to protect yourself against these sort of influences. So fortunately, more people are aware. to more people can protect themselves against these influences. One of the ways is to make sure that if you're using AI, and right now it's still in its infancy, but as it gets more and more elaborate and more, it's just better, right? As it improves, you're going to want to be really careful about what you let in your own brain, right? Because it still does have some episodes, where it's basically making things up. It doesn't have an answer and just make things up. So it's not perfect, but you definitely want to be aware. It's like a child, right? Or like you want to, what you feed it will result in the outcomes. You want to make sure you're feeding it good data. So take this down to the most important point, and I'll give it back to Doug as we wrap it up. The most important point is it's not about the AI. It's not about the LLM. It's about the cleanliness of the data sets. That is what's most important when it comes to this. Also, secondarily, would be the construct, right? How you're training it. Because if you're training it to be woke, and then it's going to be woke. If you're training it to be, more conservative, it's going to be conservative. So the training's important, but the data set's really important because garbage in, garbage out. You need to get access to good data sets. And right now on the internet, how do you get access to good data sets? The government data is manipulated or junk, as we saw a few weeks ago when the jobs numbers were 900,000 jobs in error. I still can't get over that. That's not an oops moment. That's a WTF moment.
For the how many times this occurred.
I mean, it always
it's been an error every 6 months for 6 straight months.
Well, they always get updated. I mean, to be fair, every quarter they always get updated. The fact that it was that enormous was the surprise. It was the oops moment, the WTF moment. But point being is you need good data. The government doesn't have good data because it's run by people, and people make mistakes, or they deliberately make mistakes to tell a certain story, which, governments around the world do this. We're not special. So the point is, how do you get access to good data? I don't know. I mean, that's the question that has to be answered is how do you get access to good data? What is considered good data? Who's providing the data? You say, well, government data, it's fine. Yeah, but it's provided by the government. And the government wants to say something, it will. Like right now, I have a hypothesis, this is why I have my tinfoil hat on, is that the government is trying to make the economy look good until the election, at which case, the most likely, we're probably going to fall apart. And we don't have time to show the charts here, but there's a lot of data that's things are starting to unwind and not look good. My guess is they're trying to make it look as good as they can until after the election. And then after the election, it can happen whatever happens because the election's over. And my guess is, the people in power want it to be better because they want to stay in power. And it's not Democrats. It's all people want that, right? And both parties want, if you're in power, you want to stay in power, so you want a good economy. So my guess is after the election, probably we'll start to see a lot of, revisions in a worse way. But we don't know. That's a guess. So I'm going to take off my tinfoil hat and let Doug wrap it up here.
Okay, then. Well, hey, Kirk, appreciate it. All right, well, I'm going to wrap up because I know it's that time, and I appreciate you having me again. Listen, if you are a family that is, and we're not going to get into the data, we've gone into it before, and we'll get into it again, but right now, let's just put it this way. Across the country, and especially in certain states, 50% of people are struggling to be able to afford their bills. Credit card defaults are up. We actually saw a new stat that just came out. We'll get into this later, that about half of the mortgages in our house in the country are now paid off. Okay, excellent. But that also shows that just having your mortgage paid off does not necessarily fully translate to feeling economically healthy, right? So I'm sure a lot of these people would like to have some liquidity. And if we're talking about liquidity, basically there's 6 major risks that people have to worry about for retirement and financially health. And one, of course, is liquidity. I'll come back to that. There's mortality, there's inflation, there's taxes, there's market volatility, there's longevity. All right. So when you add these things up, it's important to really make sure you understand and stress test which of these problems are going to be a problem for you. When it comes to liquidity, this is probably one of the biggest problems. Access to capital is the biggest cause of financial stress. And if any of you are actually looking at housing, or number 2, looking at college, then liquidity is going to be a major focal point for you, because where are you going to get the money for college? You've either already saved it, or you're going to have to have enough cash flow to cover it. and make smart financial choices around that. Otherwise, you're going to have to figure out how to deal with that in the future as you manage the loans you're going to have to take and ultimately, or not having enough liquidity for other things. If this is something that is a concern of yours, and I know for most of you listening, it is, putting your head in the sand like an ostrich is not going to help you. Okay, this is not going away. You might have a 14-year-old, you might have a 6-year-old, you might have an 18-year-old. Guess what? There's going to be a deadline and a time limit on this. And the earlier you start, the earlier that you can make a good outcome happen. Find out more information on this because you can't afford not to, and you must integrate this with the rest of your financial plans. You can go to our website at mergentcollegeadvisors.com, and that is MERGENT, mergentcollegeadvisors.com for more information.
Great. Well, Doug, I always appreciate you coming on the show, sharing your wit and wisdom with us. That's the show for this week. Thank you again for joining us, Money Tree Investing Podcast. My name is Kirk Chisholm, wealth manager of Innovative Advisor Group. We don't just manage your wealth, we make your life better. You can find more about me at innovativewealth.com. And of course, you can find me every week here on the show. Please remember to subscribe to the podcast and the podcast app of your choosing. You can also check out the show at moneytreepodcast.com. On our website, you'll have access to the show notes, resources, and the archive shows. Also, we're now on YouTube. Please check out our YouTube channel. When you're there, please subscribe and leave a comment. Lastly, please leave a short rating and comment on the podcast app of your choice. Oh, and don't forget, do your own research. This show is for informational use only. We're not telling you what to think, merely how to think about investing. We're also not selling any products or services, so do not consider this advice. If you have any problems with the show, I blame Putin. Please send an email, express your feelings. If you're seeking financial advice, talk to an oracle, or a fortune teller, or maybe just a licensed financial advisor. I'm one, but as I said earlier, I'm not selling anything. But I'm easy to find. Have a great week ahead, and remember, no one will care about your money like you do. So invest in your life.